Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about some of my biggest reading disappointments of 2022. Luckily for me though, this was a pretty good year for reading. There wasn't all that much that disappointed me, but there were some stuff, so it's worth talking about them. Before we begin, don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and let me know down in the comments what were some of your biggest reading disappointments of last year. So first up is a book that I enjoyed, but that ultimately disappointed me, and that is The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. I've read both The Idiot and Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, and I have adored those books. They're some of my favourite books of all time, and so I was really looking forward to finally sinking my teeth into this book because it's seen as Dostoevsky's masterpiece by a lot of people, and one of the best books of world literature as well. But unfortunately, this book just did not live up to my expectations, and I would put it below both The Idiot and Crime and Punishment. I should say that I did give this book 4 stars on Goodreads, so I by no means hate this book or don't think it's worth anyone's time. It just didn't live up to the massive expectations that I had of it. I think my main issue with this book is that it just doesn't flow as well as Dostoevsky's other works. Throughout the book you have these long, rambling passages that touch on these big heady themes like religion, the problem of evil, God, all this stuff, the nature of good and evil. And while those things are interesting, stuff, Dostoevsky has very interesting things to say about all of these themes, I just don't think he integrates them as well into his story and his characters than he does in works like Crime and Punishment. Crime and Punishment has themes about nihilism and crime and guilt and conscience and all these things, but Dostoevsky does a great job of integrating that into his characters and the story, so you don't feel like these two things are in conflict. But in this book it feels like the plot and the story and even the characters sometimes just stop being characters in order to go into these big long digressive passages. Father Zozima's speech is a great example of this. It's held by some people to be one of the best parts of the book, but I just don't see that. What I see here is just a huge rambling passage that's interrupting the story, and it just doesn't do it for me. I much prefer a novel where the themes are integrated into the story rather than a novel where the themes take over the story and the story just becomes kind of a background for these themes. I think ultimately for me what makes a novel is that it's primarily a work of fiction, and it can have themes, it can have ideas, but ultimately it should be focused on that side of things. It should be focused on characters, plot, and the aesthetic qualities of the novel, rather than trying to be a philosophical treatise. And I think when works of art delve into that, trying to be a philosophical treatise, they tend not to work as well. And this, for me, was why I didn't get on with Brothers Karamazov. Yes, it has these great themes, it has things that you could talk about for days, it's probably Dostoevsky's most complex work, but I just think because those themes take over and get in the way of the characters, get in the way of the plot, it just doesn't hang together well as a whole. That said, I think this is definitely a book that I will give a reread because it's just a very long, complex story, and so it's not the sort of thing you can just read once and then dismiss offhand. There are lots of interesting things that Dostoevsky has to say here, so it's, on that merit alone, it's worth another read. I also think that another issue that I had with the story, which isn't Dostoevsky's fault, it's the translator. I found the translation of the story really annoying because this novel is set not in the present time, it's set in the past, and the translator tries to keep certain elements of the text in that kind of old style, especially in the prose. It reads like an old book, but then in the dialogue he uses certain phrases every now and then that just sound really modern, and they just don't work for me at all. I really don't like it when translators try and update a text and take it out of its time. If it's set in the Victorian period or whatever, or set in the medieval period, then when you translate it, you should try and keep it in the style of that period, since it's set in that time and it just makes more sense. But in this book what we had some of that kind of archaic language, but then some of that language was modernized, and it just didn't work, it didn't hang together, and I do think that irritated me quite a lot. So one thing that I will do when I read this again is pick up a different translation and see if it was a translation issue rather than an issue with Dostoevsky. So overall, I do think that this was an interesting book. It's a rich book, it's definitely Dostoevsky's most complex work, but in terms of enjoyment, satisfaction, and just taking it as a complete novel with an integrated plot, characters and themes, I just don't think it hung together as well as Dostoevsky's other work that I've read. I thought The Idiot was a lot better in terms of its characters, and I think Crime and Punishment is just a great blend of themes, character and plot. It's pretty much a perfect story for me. But I also think there were issues with the translation, so if any of you have any favourite translations of this book, let me know in the comments and I will take a look at that when I reread this book. So next up we have Anne Rice and her book Blood Canticle. Blood Canticle is the final instalment in her first kind of run-through with the Vampire Chronicles, and it is probably one of the worst books I've ever read, and certainly by a mile one of the worst books, well, the worst book in the Vampire Chronicles series. Now, before I start ranting about this terrible book, I will say that Rice did also appear on my best books of 2022 as well. So, you know, she is a very good writer. It's just that with this book, she just went really off the rails with it. In fact, in a way, it's almost amazing that the person who wrote, you know, classics like Interview with a Vampire could write something this terrible, really. You have poor characterization, where characters are just completely inconsistent from their past incarnations. You have Lestat at the forefront of this, who in previous books is this romantic, you know, Lothario type who speaks in highfalutin language, and in this book he speaks like a sort of rough and tumble hillbilly at sometimes, a sassy queen at other times. It's just completely erratic and weird. You have unbelievable romances darting around. Lestat falls madly in love with Rowan Mayfair for no apparent reason. I would say that Rice has always struggled with telling compelling relationships. She relies very much on these big romantic love at first sight tropes, and sometimes that can work. It just didn't work in this case. Another thing that bugged me about this book is that it is meant to be the culmination of several crossover novels with Rice's Mayfair Witches series. And while the book does bring in characters from both series, it wraps up these stories in some of the most unsatisfying ways. Whether it's the introduction of Merrick in the novel Merrick, only to end up killing her off before this book even begins, whether it's the Taltos bringing them back for like 5 minutes at the end and just having a very dull reunion scene with these characters. Mona Mayfair, her storyline, she's back and she's as annoying as ever, and her character is completely inconsistent. One minute she is a damsel in distress, completely weak and powerless. The next minute she's the kind of Mary Sue that she was in the Mayfair Witches. And at one point she's branded a Jezebel by Lestat in one of the weirdest and most awkward scenes I have ever read in anything. It's just completely inconsistent, completely all over the place. And the icing on the case with this book is the introduction, when Rice essentially speaks through the start to her audience and rants about, you know, against her audience, because she had a, you know, a mixed reception for the last book that was told from the start's perspective, which was Memnoch the Devil. And she basically just says that her audience who criticized her are unsophisticated because they didn't understand the themes that she was going for in this, you know, this sweeping epic that she wrote. And it's just kind of insulting to talk to people in that way. It's a bit embarrassing. You know, if you want to have fun and play with your fans, or maybe, you know, poke fun at them or whatever, you could do it in a more artful way, but instead what we get is a very awkward rant that, you know, wasn't good then and certainly hasn't aged well either, although it is kind of, you know, entertaining like a car crash to read it, so it's worth picking up maybe just to read that and see what she says. Still, this hasn't completely killed my love of the Vampire Chronicles series and Anne Rice's work in general. I will be picking up with the final 3 books that she wrote, because I have generally heard good things from you guys on those 3 books, especially the first one. Although some people also do seem to dislike them, so I'll be interested to see where I sit on that side when I come to those books, which I will be doing hopefully very soon. Next up we have The Wheel of Time, and in particular the 8th book in the series, The Path of Daggers. So I was attempting to do a second read-through, listening to the audiobooks this time, of The Wheel of Time in preparation for the series when it came out, and now it could be because the series was just so awful and I disliked it so much that like, you know, stopped me from being motivated to carry on with the series, but I also think it might be Book 8, The Path of Daggers, which I just found a bit of a chore to read. Now, The Wheel of Time is known for Book 7 to Book 10 or 11 being quite difficult to get through. People call it a slog, and indeed it is. But some people say that when you read the series for a second or even third time, this aspect of the series isn't as bad. But I disagree. I still don't find these middle books very compelling, and I read The Path of Daggers, I think, in January, and that's just stopped me dead for carrying on with the series, and I haven't gone any further. I think The Wheel of Time could be one of the best fantasy series ever if it was not just so unnecessarily bloated. Like many fantasy authors, it seems, Jordan gets so caught up in his world building and, you know, the need to create new cities, new characters, all these various factions, that he just gets lost in his own world. He gets lost in the narrative. And while that can be interesting to some extent, in terms of The Wheel of Time, what you actually end up getting is lots of characters that just come across as cardboard cutouts. This is especially true of the Aes Sedai, who are, you know, basically just the same woman over and over again, you know, variations on a theme maybe, but they're very similar, and it's very hard to just remember or distinguish one woman from another. What it also means is that the central plot, the main characters and the main story just is stalled for several books. And The Path of Daggers is a really good example of this. You have all of the main characters just constantly stuck in a rut, and as a reader you're really wanting them to progress, and you might get a small moment where it looks like things are about to pick up, and then they don't, and things just carry on slogging along. And it's just quite dull to read, really. One thing that I really enjoyed about the first 5 books of the series is that every single book, the characters always go through a particular journey. Whether it's the first book when they mature in terms of, they have ideals about how fun an adventure would be, and they realise that that's not quite how that's going to go. They realise that going on adventure is dangerous, boring at times, all these things. Then in the second book, they're a bit more independent. They break off from the guide character Moraine and start doing their own independent things. And I would say throughout the whole first 5 books, you have this slow maturation of the central characters. But after that point, most of them just stagnate for several books, and it's not really until the end where we get back to satisfying novels that have a compelling story with central characters who develop throughout the course of the story. I don't know whether I will carry on with the Wheel of Time. Maybe I will. It's just one of those things where there are just lots of other things that I want to read, and I'm just finding that every time I'm just more inclined to read something else than to carry on going through the slog for the second time. It is a shame because I was expecting to find it less of an issue this time, but ultimately I do think it is a big problem with this series. I think if Jordan had restrained himself a bit with his world building, then he would have told a much more satisfying story. That being said, I am glad that I did read The Wheel of Time all the way through once. It is very satisfying when you get to the end of it, but it's difficult to say how much of that satisfaction comes from just the fact that the series is so long, so you're just satisfied that you persevered with it, rather than being satisfied necessarily by the story. And now on to my final reading disappointment of this year, and that is the Dollanganger series by V.C. Andrews. So I have reviewed, I think, the first 2 books, if I remember rightly, of the series on the channel. I may do the other ones, I may not, and it's interesting because I think that Flowers in the Attic is quite a good book. It has its problems. It's a very dark, twisted story, but that doesn't really bother me. It's more just V.C. Andrews' writing style is so quirky and weird and offbeat, and it shouldn't work, but it kind of does, at least for the first book. It has this sort of childhood innocence about it that works really well for the story that she's telling. These children losing their innocence, trapped in the attic by their evil grandmother and mother. So in that book, I think it works really well. I think the claustrophobia that she creates with them being locked up there, the sort of fairy tale feel of it, or much twisted fairy tale though it is, all of this really works in the first book. But it's one of those books where it's like, why did you create a series? I mean, it's obvious why she created a series, because it sold like, hotcakes, so of course she would make more of them. But it just doesn't really work as a series overall. A lot of the plot just becomes so over the top and so ridiculous, and while it is entertaining, it can also be quite exhausting. This is especially true in the second book, where pretty much every single piece of tension in the story, rather than giving characters proper resolutions to story arcs, if Andrews is done with them, she just has them die in a freak accident to just get them out of the way. Everyone falls in love, every single male alive falls in love with the central character, Kathy, and she has very disturbing relationships with all of these men. Now, to some extent, I guess Andrews is kind of getting across something about, she was abused and that's going to kind of continue in her life, from there on out. But it's just not very realistic to assume that everyone would fall in love with Kathy and that she would be such a perfect, attractive woman in the way that Andrews writes her. And the other books fare no better. It's just very over the top, it's very dramatic, and in a way it is entertaining. One thing that I will say for the series as a whole is that it is entertaining. I mean, I read the whole thing, I didn't stop reading them, so Andrews is doing something right. But I do think the series is kind of like junk food, in the sense that yes, you're entertained, but if you stop and think about the narrative, the story, the technique, it really doesn't have a lot going on. With the exception of the first book, which I think actually is quite an interesting thing on its own, and is a story that you could just read on its own as well. Although it does end with a kind of cliffhanger, it could quite happily end there. It's not like it needs to be resolved. So I think, yep, the first book is quite good, but the series as a whole did disappoint me. Although I will say that I quite liked the prequel book that focuses on the grandmother character. I don't necessarily always like it when they try and humanize people, and I wasn't fully convinced that the transition that she goes through from, a good, ultimately good woman to the horrible tyrant that we get in Flowers of the Attic, didn't quite buy that. But as a novel, I did think it was kind of interesting to explore her character. I would definitely recommend reading the first book, and I wouldn't say don't read the rest of the series, because it did entertain me, but I don't think I'll be reading it again. Alright, that's all my disappointments of 2022. As I said, there weren't really that many. I had a pretty good year for picking books that I would enjoy. Nothing really bad aside from Blood Canticle, really, and some of the Dollenganger books maybe. But overall, a pretty good year for reading. Let me know down in the comments what were some of your biggest disappointments of the year and what were some of the worst books that you read this year. Hopefully 2023 will turn out to be just as good, if not a better year for reading than this one was. Until the next video, ta-ra!